Today on Holiday House Tips, we are going to be discussing stakes and rope strings and how to properly secure your decoration, your inflatables to the ground so they don't fly away or get damaged. So the first stake that most inflatables come with these days are these small metal ones. Now I will say you probably don't want to use these to secure your inflatables to the ground. We've used them before and they don't seem to work at all. It doesn't matter if it's a small inflatable or a big inflatable, they just tend to get ripped right out of the ground by even a slight wind, a moderately strong wind I guess. It'll just rip them right out of the ground, whether it's a tether stake or a ground stake. I would recommend not using these, getting some better stakes, and just, we still keep these, we don't throw them away or anything. We use them for other things, but as far as securing our inflatables to the ground, they do not work well at all. I'm assuming they put them in most decoration inflatable boxes these days because they're probably the cheapest to produce, would be my guess. These are these are fairly common in inflatables that have the big motors. The small motors, they typically only have these ones. But these are really the same thing. I mean, one just has teeth and a little bit shorter. The other one does not have teeth. I would imagine the teeth would be better. It'd stay in the ground better. I don't know. I'm not a scientist. I haven't done any experiments or anything. That's just my guess. The teeth help keep it in the ground better. But they both work really well though. For big stakes, or I'm sorry, for big inflatables, small inflatables, these work really well. So you should use these if you could buy them like in bulk. Like if you have a large display, like 20 or 50 or more inflatables, and you need more of these, you should see if you can buy them in bulk somewhere. Maybe they work really well. You don't need anything too fancy for most of your inflatables. This will do the job. I mean, maybe if you have really giant inflatables, like they're really huge or they're like 20 feet tall, then these probably wouldn't do the job if it gets windy out. The next most common stake that you come in inflatable boxes are these ones. Now these usually come with the really big inflatables. I don't know about the 20 footers. We don't have any 20 footers, so those might come with even bigger stakes or different kinds of stakes. But there's two different sizes. There's just, I don't have another one available at the moment to show you, but there's these smaller ones, and there's the ones that look almost exactly the same, but they're maybe like 3 or 4 inches longer, something like that. These are, we refer to these as just spiral stakes. And then these are pretty rare. They don't come in a lot of inflatable boxes, but they do come in some of them, and you just call them orange ones. These work well enough as well. I wouldn't use them for big inflatables, but for like the smaller inflatables, they work just well. We usually save these and only use them if we know we're near like one of our sprinkler heads or irrigation system. We don't want to use a really big stake and then it goes too far in the ground and damages it. So we kind of use these ones. I mean, you see they're a little bit short. I mean, an inch or two shorter than that one, and then 3 or 4 inches shorter than that one maybe. Whatever. But anyway, it's still shorter, smaller. So we use them around our sprinkler heads, and also any buried cables we have in the ground, like our phone or cable or electricity buried in the ground, the cables. So we use these, so that way they don't go as far in the ground, so hopefully they don't hit anything. And also, so those are the most common types of stakes. Again, stay away from. They work well enough for most of your decorations. These you want to use for your bigger decorations, and these you want to use for your smaller decorations. I'd say 8. It depends how wide it is, but typically how tall it is. Probably don't want to use these on any more than they're 8 feet tall typically. But you can use them for anywhere you want, but we save them for special occasions, like I said, the sprinkler heads. So skip these. Now when it comes to securing your decoration to the ground, there are 2 different kinds of ways that most inflatables have. I would say, well, yeah, almost all inflatables have, really. There's the ground tether, the ground stake, and then the tether stake. The tether stake are these strings that attach to a loop, these strings that attach to a loop on the inflatable, usually higher up on the inflatable, a couple feet. It's been, about halfway through up, a third of the way up. Windy today. And these attach to the ground. Obviously, the string attaches to the ground. And then see, like, by the ground stake, there we go. There's a ground stake. You see that like for example this one, there's a little loop on the bottom of the inflatable, and that attaches through the loop. The stake attaches through the loop directly into the ground. It's not attached via a string. So like I said, you want to keep away from the metal ones if you can. What we do, since we do both Christmas and Halloween, instead of keeping the stakes inside the box inside each inflatable box that the stakes came with, the inflatable came with, we instead keep all the stakes in a different separate tote, and we separate them. Whoa, really windy today. We separate them. We separate all the metal stakes and the tent stakes and the spiral stakes. We keep them all separate totes, and that way we can use all the stakes we have for both Halloween and Christmas. That way it's like, we have so many of those metal stakes, because these small 3.5 foot ones nowadays only come with small metal stakes, and we don't like that. So now we can use, for example, our Christmas tent stakes for our Halloween inflatables that only come with those small metal stakes. And even some of the larger inflatables these days come with those metal ones, the small metal ones. And the purpose of those is that you're supposed to stake the big motor to the ground. I'll show you where the idea you're supposed to do it is. Here's a big motor. It sits on the ground. I can find it in here. Right there, might be kind of hard to see. But there's a hole right here in the foot. That's where you're supposed to put those metal stakes, and those typically just don't work that well, those metal stakes, so I recommend not using them. Instead, if you have some of those spare spiral stakes, what you can do is put that in the hole instead. You see right here, you see the stake goes right through that hole there, the spiral stake, and it's much more secure. This one actually is it's a little loose, but it's still staying in the ground. That's good. I have another one over here. Again, a little loose. It has rained a lot lately, I made it loose, but it's still working really well. It's keeping it in there. That's the most important thing. You can also, if you don't have enough spiral stakes, you can use tent stakes. You can see right here where the loop, there's a little loop that connects the foot of the motor to the inflatable. You just put a tent stake right through it, make sure it goes through, it's part of the stake, and that usually works well enough. It depends on how big the motor is, but that usually works well enough. Preferably if you have metal stakes, use those, but this would also work. Just be careful when you're putting this in the ground. You don't want to accidentally hit like the legs of the motor and damage the motor. Oh, it's kind of windy today. I do not think we're going to be putting our display up tonight. So that's what you should do with the. Oh, and speaking of the big motors that are on the ground, you want to secure the big motors to the ground, whether you use tent stakes or spiral stakes, or if you have no choice, those small metal stakes are better than nothing. The small metal stakes are better than nothing. The reason you want to do that is because even if you secure it really well, the tether stakes, and let's just say it's really well, it's not going to fly away. Let's just say that that's the case. You still don't want the motor moving, because then even though it's secure to the ground, the motor could move through the wind. The wind could pick it up and knock it over and just knock it around. The next thing you know, your inflatable moved a foot or two overnight because of the wind. Now it's in different positions. Therefore, you want to stake it down. But most importantly, here's a better one. I did a ground stake here. That one's really secure. Look at that. It's not even moved. This is our giant pumpkin. He's really in there now. You want to, but even if you, but you still, it's important to stake it down anyways, because it's just another layer of protection to make sure your inflatable does not fly away. You do not want your inflatable flying away. What could happen also if you don't stake down the motors, that wind could get underneath it. They're really big, hard to tell. Maybe you can see my previous videos where this guy's blown up, but if he's fully blown up and the wind could get underneath the inflatable, it could just lift the inflatable right off the ground, and that's not good. You don't want that. That's just make it easier for the wind to just pull the inflatable right out of the ground and bye-bye inflatable. You don't want that. So you want to secure it to the ground via the motor. If you some way the motor. They've had a big motor like this anyways. So that's very important to do that. Some of these big inflatables, inflatables with the big motors, they actually have, I can't think of an example to show you at the moment, but they actually have, some of them do have loops on the ground like I showed you earlier with a small one. So they have ground loops directly on the ground. Now in that case, as long as you secure that properly, the ground loops properly to the ground, you don't really need to do the motor itself, because the ground loops are doing everything I just mentioned. It's keeping it nice and flat to the ground so the wind can't get underneath it. It's another source of securing it to the ground. But if you really wanted to, you could also do both the ground and the motor to really give it some extra, some extra protection from being blown away. You also sometimes forgot to mention that if you don't secure it to the ground, or you don't secure the motor to the ground, what could happen is that the motor just flips over. It's like upside down or to the side, and then the fabric from the material kind of gets in the fan and doesn't blow up well. It's just better to either use the ground loops if they have them. They typically don't, the big ones, or secure the motor to the ground. One last thing about stakes: you want to use a mallet. Do not push these stakes in the ground with your hand. First of all, it just hurts. You do it once or twice, no big deal. You do this like hundreds of times, you have like a lot of inflatables like we do, it's gonna hurt your hand. You don't want to push me with the hand. Not only that, when you use a mallet, you're using an equal amount of force on the whole stake, so the stake drives to the ground nice and easy, just how you want it. When you push it by your hand, you're applying unequal force. Maybe you're pushing it in too far on the front of the stake or whatnot, and then you could just easily snap the stake in half. You don't want that. You don't want a lot of broken stakes. So just use a mallet. The only exception I would say is if you are near your sprinkler head or a buried cable, and then I'd say you might want to push those ones in by hand, because that way, if you feel a little bit of pressure, or the resistance I should say, something hard, that could be a sprinkler head, it could be buried cable. I mean, it could just be a rock too, or really hard dirt. But if you feel any sort of resistance, you should probably just move the stake a little bit and try again and push it in the hand. If you use a mallet, you might just use, a mallet works so much better than your hand. It might just drive that stake right through your sprinkler head or your buried cable. So that's probably the only time I would do it by hand. When you use the spiral stakes, sometimes you just twist them with your hand and they go in just fine. Oh, and they go in just fine. See if I can maybe show you an example here. But a lot of times you twist them and they go in just fine. Fine. I can see, like, just in the ground over here. It depends on how hard your ground is, or if it's soft from the rain. Or I see sometimes, if your ground's soft just because you have soft soil, or been raining, like it's been raining a lot here, so the ground nice and soft. That went in. I just twisted it with my hand just fine. Look at that. I'm really trying. I really am, and it's not budging an inch. That's why these work so well. You should use these when you can. But these work especially for big motor or big inflatables. When I use these, even for the tether stakes, it's a good idea to use these for the tether stakes. The 10 stakes work most of the time, but these just work so much better. Look at that. But if you can't get in the ground because the ground's hard or whatnot, you can get a screwdriver or some long piece of metal or something, like, at least this long or so. That way you can use both. Grab it on each side with your hand and just twist it to get it in the ground. Can't really show you because I have to hold the camera. But you just twist it in the ground. That's not an easy way to get it out of the ground too. But like if you do Christmas and it gets cold, the ground might be frozen solid at the end of the year. It's hard to get them out of the ground. Use a screwdriver or some sort of piece of metal. See, what else I want to talk about? Oh yeah, about the strings. Now, we've noticed that the strings that come with inflatables, typically these black strings that are on usually have a clip to fit on the loop here. We've noticed those work just fine. Those work just fine. We've been doing this for 13 years now, I think. We put up about almost what is that, almost 400, well, almost 300 inflatables a year, maybe a little over 300 inflatables a year. So we put up literally thousands of inflatables up over the years, thousands of inflatables, and those strings have only broken maybe a dozen times, if that often. So you're talking about over a, what is it, probably over a 90% success rate, considering each inflatable typically has between 2 and 4 tethers, or yeah, these 2 or 4 strings, and only maybe a dozen have broken over those years. That is really a pretty good success rate. So, but if you don't feel comfortable with using those, you could, you can buy something stronger at, Home Depot or Lowe's. Use something stronger if you want, or especially if a string does break, you probably should go ahead and upgrade to a better string. Maybe that inflatable, those strings don't work well with that inflatable. But yeah, even for big inflatables, small inflatables, typically the strings they come with work just fine. It's kind of surprising considering the metal stakes they give you don't work that well. I think I'm gonna cut the video right here real quick, because I think there's something else I wanted to include, but I can't remember, so I'm gonna pause the video here until I remember. Well, I don't know if this is what I want to talk about, but since it is windy, I will talk about the wind. You don't want to inflate your inflatables with really strong wind or really strong wind gusts. They can. I've had neighbors who have inflatables and they didn't realize you shouldn't have them on too strong winds, or they didn't realize how strong the wind was or whatnot, and they said they just happened to be looking outside, their inflatable is blowing up and everything. She literally just watched the wind just take it away. If it just came right out of the ground, all 6 came right out of the ground, it flew away. She never saw it again. So it happens. You don't want to turn these inflatables on in really strong winds. Even the small little guys, if you have small ones, the wind could, especially if you're using those little metal stakes, the wind could just come along, rip all those stakes right out of the ground, and just take the inflatable away with it. And also keep in mind, there's always going to be a failure point, and that's usually the loop loop. It's usually the tether loop here. You can have a really strong, rope. You could be using chain, metal chain. You could be using the, 3-foot stakes to keep it secure to the ground. This will fail eventually. That'll tear off. You have a big hole in your inflatable. Best case scenario, you have a big hole in your inflatable. Worst case, all the anchor points will rip off and your decoration will fly away and you'll never see it again. So do not turn your inflatables on when it's really windy out. It might take some trial and error to kind of, at first you might be a little too cautious, but then, oh, it's too windy, but eventually if you find it good, you get the hang of saying, okay, it's too windy or it's not that bad. One other thing to notice, some of my decorations, you can see we kind of tie them to these big stakes, the big poles, don't fly away. You want to be careful what I call sail effect. I mean, look at this guy, you probably should take him down. But to show you, see, he's just up there because he's tied between 2 different posts, and you can see the wind is just pushing right at it. You can see it's kind of billowing out. That's what I call a sail effect, like a sail on a boat. A sail. That whole point of a sail is to capture wind. You don't want your inflatables capturing wind. This is actually bad for it. When you take there's one strap down. Because look at it, it's just tearing against it, and that could, even when it's not blown up, that could put a hole. It could rip these this tether off and just send it flying. So if you do something like this, make sure you at least take one down, kind of like this guy. It's just a one. That's still not ideal, but it's not as bad at having it like that. You might even want to take that down. You just take it down for now, and when the wind subsides, you can plug your decorations in. You can tie them back up to the posts. So I think that's all I have to say about this video. I hope everyone found some useful tips. Thank you for watching. See you next time.